morning, everyone. My name is Tamara Henry, and I serve as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Academic Dean here at New York Theological Seminary. It is my distinct honor to introduce this year's George W. Weber Lecturer, the Reverend Dr. William Joseph Barber II. The Reverend Dr. William Joseph Barber II is the President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. A former Mel King Fellow at MIT, he currently serves as visiting professor of public theology and activism at Union Theological Seminary and as a senior fellow at Auburn Seminary. Reverend Dr. Barber is the author of 4 books and is a much sought after speaker and presenter, having also served as a speaker at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. As many of us know, he is a regularly featured guest on numerous media outlet sites, including CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, among many others. Please join me once again in welcoming our 2021 George W. Weber Lecturer, the Reverend Dr. William Joseph Barber II.
Gracious and eternal God, we thank you for your goodness and your mercy. We know you to be a mother to the motherless and a father to the fatherless. Whenever you call men, women, others to preach, you take the risk of putting treasure in trash, treasure in an earthen vessel, sometimes flawed and failing and unfaithful. But you do it that the excellency of the power might be of thee and not of us. Hide us behind the cross. Keep us forever covered in your way and in your spirit. Use us for your glory. Let the words of our mouth and the meditation of our heart be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and blessed Redeemer. Amen. I am so honored to join the New York's School of Theology, Theological School, to your president, my Texan. I stayed a part of my life in Texas, and so I claim her now as a comrade. To all of you, to Brother Cassius, who's been so kind and gracious in helping us get started, and to the brothers behind the scenes, sisters behind the scene, because they make these lectures online work. To my colleague at Union Theological Seminary, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, to over 47 coordinating committees around the country, the Poor People's Campaign, over 2,500 clergy from various faith traditions, and tens of thousands of people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality, and some 200 partners that have now come together since 2018. I am always moved by being invited to these lectures. And today I come with agenda. I want to talk about why we must have in America a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington to declare and demand new possibilities in America. And that we're planning for that, and we want your school and your institution and hundreds of others to join with us in mobilizing thousands for June 18th, 2022, for a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington to declare new possibilities. Poor and low-wealth people taking the stage, along with moral and religious leaders, their advocates, and even wealthy people with a conscience. Now, somebody might ask, well, where do you get that from? Are you just following something you saw in history? Well, not actually. And then we are. But all the way back 2,600 years ago, when the nations were in crisis, Amos was confronted by God to speak to the nation. He, like me, was just a country boy. And Amos was told by God that the times they lived in were terrible. He said some people had even given up because of the evil and the injustices toward the poor, and others were so wrong. Imagine Amos coming to New York Theological Seminary and having that conversation. And God says to Amos, in the midst of all that was happening, and even in the depression of the people, he said, I need you to call a meeting. I need you to call a meeting of the remnant of the people who are willing to shut down the roads, the factories, in the Message Bible, that's how it reads, the schools, and to do it in a way non-violently and go into the street and cry and wail. In other words, declare that something's broken, something's wrong. And God says, Amos, tell them that when you do this, then I, God, will visit you, and that remnant will be the centerpiece in letting justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And then in Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 4, Jesus begins his public ministry in the public square, preaching in the ghetto of Nazareth, and he declares, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, the patokos, those who've been made poor by systems of exploitation. It's amazing that Jesus did that in his public sermon. He almost got killed that same day. He listed the kind of people that we had to bring together and come together, the poor, the brokenhearted, the blind, the imprisoned. And then he declared Jubilee, the all of those who have been made to feel unacceptable. The truth is, brothers and sisters, we believe we face a crisis of possibility, a crisis of civilization in our country, and in some ways to say around the world. You know, we hear all of these debates about top line, whether it's going to be 3 trillion, 2 trillion total cost, whether we're going to do means testing in order to help people who are trying to live in a mean world. But the bigger question is, why is it not possible, or do we believe it is possible for the richest nation in the history of the world to provide for everybody's needs? And if we don't believe that, and if we refuse to do that, and now nearly 50% of people in this country, 43% of these people are poor and low wealth, even and 8 million more after COVID, then what's really wrong with the soul of the country? Why is it so hard to do what is so right? Why do we have a crisis of possibility, a crisis of civilization, and what is the particular role of people of faith? Because too often we are caught up in the commentary about the probability of passing a policy. And oftentimes, even in Washington, when they talk about a policy, they do not talk about policy to eradicate something. They talk about policies that will do a little something, enough to say we did something. Sometimes something that is indeed transformative, but part of the reason it's so transformative is because so little has been done in yesteryear. Just this week or two ago, we were told there was a framework for a $1.7 trillion Build Back Better plan. In fact of the matter is, we were told it is transformative and the largest since the Great Depression. Now, that is true, but in that truth is also sadness. If since the Great Depression, the most we've committed to the people is $1.7 trillion over 10 years, $170 billion a year. In light of all that has happened since the Great Depression, and in light of all the poverty that has existed, and in light of all the needs, that even the fact that it is transformative, it's sad in some sense that we have not transcended problems that we could have transcended long ago if we had the right consciousness. Otto Schwammer, who's an economist at MIT, says we have a problem in the American economic system. It's called consciousness. And Brother Swiglitz, a Nobel Peace Prize economist, said we ask the wrong questions too often. The question is not how much does it cost to address the issues, it's how much does it cost for us not to. The truth is, whatever is good, and there are a lot of good things in this plan we just heard about, and maybe by now has passed by the time of this lecture, but it's only good because we had to fight. Think about it, had to fight and march and sit in and get arrested just for people to have hearing aids, just for children and families to have a child tax credit, earned income tax credit. Had to fight. So there are many good things in it, but it didn't happen because of just a back room. It happened because people in West Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Texas, and others in DC went into the streets and said, you're going to do this. Because in June, there were those saying, we're not going to do it. we're going to deal with our roads and our technology, but we're not going to deal with the infrastructure of people's daily lives, healthcare, and education, and climate. And we're not going to deal with the infrastructure of our democracy, which is voting. But in some sense, people had a meeting and said, no. We're going to fight. And so we have, hopefully by the time I speak now, this plan. But the fight is not over. Sure, we should take, and the extending of child tax credit goes to the poorest families. And sure, we should be glad about the millions of families that will help. And surely we should be glad about finally, after years, having universal pre-K for more than 6 million 3- and 4-year-olds. And finally, we have some climate investments. Not all that's needed, but finally we have a focus and an acknowledgement in policy that we have to deal with this issue. And then find $130 billion to expand Medicaid that could help 9 million people in states that for some reason have refused to expand Medicaid since it was passed, since the Affordable Care Act. Finally, we have some commitment to affordable housing. Finally, we have some commitment to rental assistance and down payment assistance, and some more money for Pell Grants. Finally, and we ought to take that. We ought to grab that. And we ought to claim that as part of the victory. Everything that I just listed and more, the Poor People's Campaign, for instance, has been pushing for and laying out for years, and even spoke with the President's Economic Council at the beginning of this year. But because we are people of faith from the tradition of the Amoses and we walk in the way of Jesus, we can't just be satisfied with a step. We must complete the full journey of recognizing the totality of everyone's humanity. We can't just be satisfied as long as there are people still crying and weeping in private, as long as there are many who may never be touched. As long as we know, for instance, that the Economic Policy Institute said we actually needed $10 trillion, $4 trillion more than what even Bernie Sanders said, to fix the problems that existed prior to COVID and before COVID. After COVID. We know that the bill that is now been pushed is only about 2.5% of what we're going to spend anyway over the next 10 years. We know that 1.7 trillion is not a lot of money. I mean, we say it because it's a lot when you say it, but it's $170 billion a year for 10 years in an economy where the budget is already $46 trillion. We know this is not a transcendent amount. It may be transformative in some way. We know that 1.7 trillion could easily, in fact, 10 trillion could actually be done if just billionaires who made $2 trillion so far during COVID would just pay their fair share. $2 trillion while 8 million more people fell into poverty. And we also know that we spent $21 trillion in war and militarism since 2001. I want to come back to that, but hold that for a minute. How can you do that and then claim you don't have the money over 10 years? In fact, we spent nearly $5 trillion in COVID relief since COVID started, and the bulk of that money went to corporations. The first COVID relief, 84% of it went to corporations, and some corporations received $1 trillion, almost $2 trillion in one day. Boom. And yet, for those that need to be in the meeting, those who are crying, those who are hurting, we're constantly told, wait. So we must grab what has been done, but not be settled there. You got to know what's not in the bill. Paid leave is not in this bill. Even though at the G20, every country met with the president, they have paid leave and they have some form of universal health care. You need to know that $400 billion was suggested to pay home care workers who make less, many of them make less than a living wage, the people who wash our elderly's backside. And instead of putting that $400 billion out there, it was cut to $150 billion. You need to know that Medicare didn't include dental and vision. Sure, we are excited that it includes hearing, but to think that in this nation we couldn't do dental and hearing for our elders. You need to know that some want the child income tax credit child income tax credit to just last a year. No, it needs to be permanent. Free community college was cut out of this. The billionaire's income tax was cut. And when we cut it to 1.7, we lost 2 million jobs that would have been created, 2 million jobs. And no one is dealt yet with the filibuster, that ugly piece of piracy, that way of a few people blocking progress. And it was that filibuster had been used against efforts to end slavery, efforts to give women the right to vote, labor efforts, civil rights, all down through the years. And part of the reason is the debate, when it started, didn't start theologically, it didn't start morally, it didn't start talking about the people. It started wrongly with the lie of scarcity. The debate in the public square was about the trillions that it would cost, and not the tens of millions that would be helped, and the billions and trillions that would come back into society if a society chooses to lend to the poor. And that's why, as Amos says, and as Jesus suggests, we must have a meeting, a coming together of the remnant, a coming together of the rejected, a coming together on those on the margins. You know, when you stand beside poor and low wealth people, you can't just get excited about one battle when the victory is yet to be won. Pope Francis recently, when I was in Rome, he said, today we see that the world has never been so rich, and yet despite so much abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow. And then he says, and the problem is too much of the powers have a one-track mind. They only talk about the wealth and the middle class and say nothing about the poor, the elderly, the migrants, and he said they are mostly treated as disposable. Let me unpack some of this and show how COVID-19 has put a spotlight on the fissures of poverty and racism and what we're facing. One of the ways is, I think, the sinful way in which we called people who prior to COVID were service workers. Somebody got cute and said, no, let's call them essential workers. And the essential was to suggest to them they had to go to work. They had to move. Other people didn't have to, but they had to. But most of those essential workers were poor, low wealth workers. Those essential workers were folk that people said, you know, somebody has to cut our meat. Somebody has to get our vegetables. Somebody has to serve our food. Essential. So we changed their name to essential workers, but in policy, we treat them as though they're expendable. $7.25, most of them were. Restaurant workers make $2.13 an hour plus tips. We call them essential. But in policy, we keep treating them like expendable. Not one time did we say all essential workers are going to have free health care. All essential workers are going to have a living wage permanently, at least $15. It is sinful to call people essential and then treat them like they're expendable. And all over the country, those workers, when they talk to us, are saying, Reverend Barber, like Amos said, we need a remnant. Like God told Amos, we need a remnant. We need a meeting. We need a gathering. Not a day, but a declaration. What must we do in this meeting when we must tell the truth and put a face on the crisis of possibility? As we move around this country, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris and I, we see so much, and we understand why the prophets, like in Isaiah 10, said, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children pray. We see so much robbery and so much predatory activity in policy being directed toward the poor, because poor and poverty is not a matter of people's personal morality as much as it is a matter of public policy. Matthew 25 calls us to care for the least of these. But as we go around, we see so much policy that operates in a different, and we've got to put a face on it. We got to put a face on this crisis. We've got to turn people's ears into eyes. We must say to people, and those of you in seminaries and in churches and in faith communities, we must declare unifiedly something's wrong. But 140 million people are poor and low wealth in this nation. 52% of our children, 39 million children. 41% of our elders, 21 million people. 42% of our men, 68 million. 45% of our women, 74 million. 33% of white people, 66 million. 60% of black people, 26 million. 64% of Latinos, 38 million. 40% of Asian people, 8 million. 58% of Native and Indigenous people, 2.4 million. That is the reality that we exist in spite of the fact that the U.S. economy has grown more than 18 times in the past 50 years. And from 1973 to 2016, productivity went from 73.7%. But hourly compensation only went up 12%. We must put a face on this, tell the truth about the crisis that we live in. The top 1% share of the economy has nearly doubled from 1968 to 2017. The 400 wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom 64%. 240 million people make less than 400 people in this country, and the 400 wealthiest make an average of $90-some thousand an hour. And 3 of those people have a combined wealth of more than the combined wealth of the bottom 50% of the entire country, 160 million people. Some say this is class war. No, this is truth, because they didn't make that money without me and from the efforts of the rest of us. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Affordable housing stock has declined by 60%. In 2016, there was no state in this country and no county in this country where you could work a minimum wage job of $7.25, let alone $2.13 an hour, and afford a basic one-bedroom apartment. There are over 500,000 people experiencing homelessness every night. Every night. 47% are white, 41% are black, 22% are Latino. Many are our LGBTQ children. And then there's another 2.3 million that are included, that are on the brink of homelessness. That are on the brink of homelessness, or either sheltered. In fact, the brink of homelessness is even higher than the 2.3 trillion. We need a meeting. Amos said there must be a meeting. God said, Amos, there must be a meeting of the remnant. And then when we look at the realities, student debt in this country right now is $1.34 trillion. People just trying to educate themselves, over 44 million Americans. And 87 million people in this country are either uninsured or underinsured. Even after this crisis, or in the midst of this crisis of COVID, this health crisis, people come out still so callous that they don't want to pass health care for everybody. And many of the politicians are so predatory, like according to Ezekiel 22, when your politicians become like wolves, as it says, that they will take free health care from the people that they get simply because they get elected and we pay for it. But then they don't want the people to have the same thing. Then we've got all this racism I could talk about in a number of ways, but one of it is in voter suppression. You realize we have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was first signed. In 49 states, there have been 400 bills put in place to suppress the vote. But it's not just race. This is not just Jim Crow. This is a form of James and Jane Crow Esquire. They took off the hoods, put on suits. And the goal is not just to stop black people, but if they were to have their way and all these bills were passed, 56 million Americans, black and white and brown and Native and Asian, who voted in the last election and used certain processes as access to the ballot, would no longer have that access. That's systemic racism. That's a form of sin. And since 1976, the criminalization of poverty has raised federal spending on prisons to $7.5 billion a year. And the inmates grew from 188,000 in 1968 to over 1.5 million in 2016. And in some ways now, almost 2 million. 2 million. 2 million. 1 in 13 black adults is some way disenfranchised, even from voting because of felony convictions. Then we have ecological devastation. You know that 9 million premature deaths happen in the world, according to one stat, 9 million. because of fossil fuel chemicals. 9 million, Reverend, 9 million. This is 3 times as many deaths as from AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria combined, and 15 times more than from wars and other forms of violence. Water pollution alone kills 1.8 million people year-round. Can you imagine that? 1.8 million people year-round. And there are those that do not want to even look at it. And there, as we look at war and militarism, I told you I wanted to come back to that. We spent $21 trillion in war and militarism. You know that $21 trillion, let's think about it this way. $4.5 trillion could fully decarbonize the United States electric grid. Just 4.5 trillion. 2.3 trillion could create 5 million jobs at $15 an hour. 1.7 trillion could erase student debt. 4.49 billion could continue the extended child tax credit, CTC, for 10 years. 200 billion could guarantee free preschool for every 3 and 4 years for 10 years and could raise teacher pay. And 25 billion could provide COVID vaccines for the entire population of low-income countries around the world. We spent $21 trillion on war, the militarization of our borders and our communities. I tell you, sometimes it makes me want to go back to my days in hip hop. It's like a jungle out here. It makes me wonder how we all keep from going under. So here we are in this reality. And when you look at what Amos said and what Jesus said, we need an assembly. We need a meeting. Not just a day, but a declaration. It's a crime, said Dr. King, in a rich nation for people to receive starvation wages. God never intended for one group of people to live superfluously and in inordinate wealth, while others live in abject and deadening, killing, murderous poverty. Poverty that is not God ordained, but human greed, the result of policy. Jeffrey Sachs and I have this conversation, one of the leading economists. Poverty is a result of policy. Policy. And when you think about those essential workers too, I want to go back to them for a minute because they are like the canary in the mine. Many of them, as I said, were poor and low wealth workers. They were not paid enough to build up savings to tide them over in emergency. Most of them lacked paid sick medical leave and health insurance. They lacked access to unemployment, especially the restaurant workers, because they didn't make enough to qualify because their minimum wage is so low. They lived many times in expensive but crowded accommodations. And when we decided to give them something, we gave them a moratorium for 4 months. But in the 4th month, they had to go back and pay the third, all 3 months plus the 4th month. Well, if they didn't have the money in the 1st month to pay the 1st month, how could they pay all 4 months after 4 months? And many of them were not in union, so they had no voice. And therefore, they became the first to get, they were forced to go to work, the first to get sick, the first to get infected, the first to go to the hospital, and the first to die because they were essential, but policy treated them like they were expendable. We need a meeting. God said it to Amos. Jesus implied it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. The Christian movement began among the poor. The poor were claimed to be God's first point of attention when Jesus started his public proclamation. I've given you a lot of numbers. And I know some of you are saying, Bob, aren't you committing the same mistake that you said about others? They started with the numbers. Well, I would be if I did not give you the faces. So now that you have heard, let me turn those same ears into eyes. I want you to see Danielle, a child of God, made in the image of God, working 70 hours a week, trying to survive on $7.25. I want you to see the black man we have met who cleans people's backsides in a medical facility he can't even afford. I want you to see the lady in West Virginia who's a low-wage worker demanding 15, and she says her and her other female friends have to get together on Tuesdays and sell tacos so that they can get enough money to have a stash to pay for one another's feminine supplies during their menstrual cycles. I want you to see the Episcopal priest out in Aberdeen, Washington, who's trying to minister to a city of only 16,000 people, where 1,000 of those, almost more than 1,000, are homeless. It is the zip code with the largest number of homeless white millennials in Washington state, despite all of the wealth from Microsoft and Amazon that's in that part of the country. I want you to see the white clergy in Kentucky who introduced us to coal miners that are dying from black lung. Those in Harlan County, one of the poorest counties in America, and they told me when we went there, nobody ever comes to see about us. Lyndon Baines Johnson started the War on Poverty in Harlan County. They said since then, Democrats and Republicans have abandoned them, even no preachers even want to come back here. Why don't you vote? Because nobody calls our name. Nobody cares about us. They say we're Trump and red counties. We're not really red counties. We are counties that somebody has failed to remember. Or let me help you see and hear Callie Greer screaming, wailing in front of the United States Capitol because her daughter died right in front of her. One reason, Alabama refused to expand health care because the leadership, the Republican leadership, the governor and those could not stand the fact that it was Obamacare. There's nothing else makes sense. Well, let me introduce you to Pamela, who's dead now. She was a warrior. She told us to keep this movement going. She caught COVID. She lived in a trailer full of mold before COVID. Predatory lenders tricked her into spending over $150,000 for a trailer that wasn't worth but about $20,000. Both of her children had CPAP machines. Animals would come in and out. She couldn't go anywhere else. She had sewage in her backyard, and they ran the county sewage lines to the dog pen, to the place that housed dogs, but refused to run it to their communities. And she's dead now. Her last words to me was, Reverend Barber, we got to keep fighting. They got to hear us. Let me let you see the brother living outside in the Tenderloin of San Francisco. They shouted out one day, I didn't even know they knew. He said, Reverend Barber, Poor People's Campaign, somebody is calling our name, somebody's saying something. Or the homeless people we met with under the bridges in Wisconsin who were said, we won't be here this evening because the police are going to come and run us out. I said, why? They said, because the political conventions are coming. They do this all the time. They let us stay here, but when the political conventions come in, they run us out so that the politicians don't have to see us. Or in my own state of North Carolina, let me have you see a remnant, a rejected person. Little Ezekiel came to me one day, spoke up for his dad. His dad is a pastor, Pastor Jose, been in this country since 1985. But in the midst of all the heightened anger at our immigrant brothers and sisters, particularly Haitians and Latinos in the Trump administration, they said, you got to get out of here because of one mistake. This is a pastor. In fact, he was a guy who wasn't evangelical. He was kind of in that round of that theology, the kind of, white evangelicalism. He's not now because they abandoned him. They didn't come to see about it. But a church, an African-American church, put him up for over 2 years in sanctuary. And finally, when the new administration changed, they worked it out so he can stay. But can you imagine his family was right up the road, 40 miles, and he had to live on the parking lot in a house connected of a church for more than 2 years. When I close my eyes, sometimes I also see Vanessa and her dad, my Apache brothers and sisters, Brother Winsler, who right now are having to fight every day against a multinational company because they want to come in and destroy their holy lands to drill for some little bit of copper. And they're willing to poison the aquifers on the reservation and in the rest of that area. We've been there on those lands. It would be like somebody going to for Muslims destroying Mecca, or for Jewish people, somebody destroying Mount Sinai, or for us, somebody destroying the National Cathedral. There are real faces behind the numbers I mentioned earlier. Or Rosanelle Eaton, 95 years old. In 2013, after the Section 5, the voting right was gutted, she had to go to court with white women and Latino and students. Why? Because the new rules that North Carolina was passing would have undermined her right to vote. And she was one of the first Black women to register to vote in the South in the 1940s. She registered over 5,000 people to vote, but she at 95 had to fight. And she said to me one day, they think I'm going to die before this court case is over, but I'm not dying until we win. And when we won, she died about 2 weeks later. But it took us 4 years because of the lack of Section 5. Or Amy, a poor white woman in West Virginia who's struggling, who has a master's degree, but because the pay for teachers is so low, and when the governor tried to raise the pay, he tricked the teachers in some way. He expanded the teacher's salary a little bit, but then he cut Medicaid, he cut food stamps. Or Pam Morrison and other miners' daughters who are fighting in West Virginia. I go back there. Pam is such a warrior, but she says, I'm afraid. We're fighters because we've been through so much. Every union contract we've ever won, somebody had to die for it. And now we see people doing an insurrection at the Capitol. But those people don't care anything about us getting a living wage and health care. Or I remember my dear brother, Leon. I don't know if Leon is still alive now. He was living in a homeless camp, and we met him. He told us if we had a meeting, he was going to join us. He said, they allowed me to run $1 billion pieces of equipment in the military, but now I've come home and I can't even flip a hamburger. And he keeps a flag beside the car he sleeps in. And I asked him why, and the tent he sleeps in. He says, because I want people to look and see what happens underneath the flag right here in America. We must be honest about these politics of rejection. And why the rejected and the remnants, we've got to have a meeting to declare somebody's been hurting our brothers and sisters, and it cannot go on any longer. God told Amos, Jesus said of the Spirit, it must be what we do today when 87 million people are without health care. When we can cut and give tax breaks $2 trillion to the wealthy but can't raise living wages. When indigenous people are still suffering. When 53 years after the march to Selma, Montgomery, we have less voting rights. When a country of immigrants is weaponizing deportation. When families in Flint and 4 million other families wake up every morning and buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. And when we have this distorted moral narrative that tries to teach us a kind of religious nationalism. It doesn't talk about caring for the hungry as a nation and caring for the naked in terms of justice. It talks about a little benevolence, but never justice. It doesn't say anything about people needing a living wage and health care. But what it says is if you really want to follow God and be about a moral agenda, then you have to be against a woman's right to choose. You have to be against the LGBTQ community. You have to be for prayer in the school. You have to be for tax cuts. You have to be a Republican, and you have to believe somehow that Jesus was a founding member of the NRA. When far too many do not see that the Jewish child and the Palestinian child and the Black child and the immigrant child and the Asian child and the Native child are all made in the image of God. And we have to create a world absence of violence and war for them too. We need a meeting. We need a meeting. The rejected and the remnant must be heard. And finally, we must understand how we got here. You know, Neil Painter says that what we're seeing is the iconography of a tragic, traditionally American call and response. We take steps forward, and then there is a vicious violence outbreak, ugly, vile, rhetorically mean season of trying to push things back out of fear of other people. I could go through a lot of ways it's shown, but just for instance, let's just take one, and that is the Second Reconstruction in the 1960s or late 50s, when we got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Medicaid Office and the Economic Office of Opportunity and Community Action Agencies. And then in the midst of that, Martin, Malcolm, Medgar, and so many others were killed. But the growth, the things that happened during that period of time in so many ways, the peace movement, the women's movement, so many things happened. But it evoked a response, a backlash, especially by Southern segregation, but not just those in the South, even in the North. Richard Nixon ran on law and order, ran on putting people in their place. Kevin Phillips, one of his strategists, said, we're going to do something. We're going to figure out how to divide the country without using blatant racist language, but it will have a racial impact. And Kevin Phillips called it the Southern Strategy. In 1968, they wrote a memo to the sitting president. Jonathan Shell, talks about it in his book called The Illusion. And in there, it says how Buchanan and his Nixon aide, Kevin Phillips and others, told the president, I know how we can do this. I know how we can win. I know how we can control this country. We have to create something called positive polarization. We've got to divide the country for political advantage because they're too strong together. We can't let them be together. Some of you might remember, if you read that book, at the key line that Buchanan ends on, it's actually in Jonathan Shell's book, 1968, The Time of Illusion. He said, we must cut the Democratic Party and the country in half. And my view is that we would have the far larger half. But we must do it in a way that does not sound racist. We must use language like tax cuts and entitlements. So you see, this is a plan from 50-some years ago, many years ago. Donald Trump was not the first president to play into our worst fears. What he has done is charismatized it and financed it and added more and more violence to it. It has a history, this history of division. And we've been warned time and time again. Dr. King, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said, do you not realize that the reason there's segregation and voter suppression is because the fear of the Southern aristocracy and their counterparts, the fear of the possibility of the masses of poor Negroes and poor white folk coming together, having a meeting and forming a political power base that could restructure America's economic architecture. We've been warned that the battle in this country is not that we're strong, but that we're powerful together. It's one of the reasons Rabbi Heschel railed against individuals who stood on the sidelines. Rabbi Heschel said, there is an evil, which most of us condone and even are guilty of. It's called indifference to evil. He said, we remain neutral, impartial, and not easily moved by the wrongs done unto other people. And this indifference to evil is more insidious to evil itself. He says, we don't come together. We move in our silos. My brothers and sisters, I hear God speaking to Amos. I need a remnant. I need the remnant to come together and cry and wail in the public square. I hear Jesus saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news, to evangel, to invite the poor, the brokenhearted, the blind, all of those who've been made to feel unacceptable. It's time. It's time for a generationally transformative, conscience-changing movement that begins with a meeting, not a day, but a declaration. We've got to call this nation to repentance. We must build a third reconstruction. No time to waste. No time to waste. We've got to stop this national move away from the democracy we have more and more to a civil oligarchy, which leads right into an autocracy. It is the battle of our time. We must escalate the nonviolent moral struggle of a third reconstruction. The remnant must have a meeting in public that will call the rest to repentance, or recall enough, because God says that the remnant can actually save the nation. The remnant doesn't just take everybody, but there must be a remnant that acts like something is wrong, that cries like something is wrong, that nonviolently says something is wrong in the public square. Jesus declared his first sermon in the public square, right in the heart, right in the face. It must be a meeting that's not about a day, but a commitment commitment that we're not going anywhere. Somebody's hurting our brothers and sisters, and it's gone on far too long. The soul of democracy, yeah, even the world, we're in a crisis of democracy, a crisis of civilization, a crisis of poverty. And what is it time to do? Well, we put together a piece called The Third Reconstruction, Ending Poverty and Low Wealth from the Bottom Up. And here are some of the things that we must do. We must do even beyond what's done in these last few days. We must update the poverty measure and stop lying to ourselves as a nation about the extent of poverty and low wealth. It's not 39 million people. We must expand democratic participation and protect voting rights. We must do that. It's time. We must protect the constitutional rights of assembly and free speech. Do you see all these laws that are being passed in places trying to stop people from being able to have their free speech and to be able to protest? We must have the remnant have a meeting. We must ensure that the legislations that are passed in this country first start with how will it affect the 140 million poor and low wealth people, and how will it affect various communities disaggregated. We must fight to expand protections for frontline essential workers and guarantee income expansions of unemployment insurance and resources for children and social welfare. Yes, SNAP and WIC and CTC, child tax credit and earned income tax credit, use the tax code to address the issue of poverty. And we cannot accept what was just done as the end. It must be a beginning. It must be a push. We must have a meeting. We must raise the minimum wage fully to a living wage, and 15 has almost become obsolete now. Dr. King wanted that in March on Washington. They called for $2 an hour in 63, which would be 15 today. We must enact fair taxes on corporations and Wall Street. There must be a meeting that's willing to cry and wail in the street publicly that says we must repeal the 2017 tax code. There must be a meeting, not a Democratic meeting, a Republican meeting, not a left versus right meeting, but a right versus wrong meeting, a meeting that's rooted in our deepest moral and religious values. We must have a meeting. We must have an institute of tax, a wealth tax. We must go to work. We got to guarantee health care for all through Medicaid, through securing Medicare, and through universal single pay health care. This is not just ideas of Democrats or somebody. This is what God, everywhere Jesus went, he set up free health care. Everywhere the prophets went, they declared healing. We got to guarantee safe and quality housing for all. Even the president lives in public housing. It's called the White House. We have to guarantee the right to water and ending water and utility shutoff. It was in 1948 that the United Nations declared, and we were there after the World War II, and said that certain things were human rights. Human rights. We must implement a federal jobs program. We must use the cleaning up of the environment and addressing climate reform to do that and prioritize poor communities who get hurt first. We have to guarantee quality, safe, equitable public education. As one African proverb says, if you want to know how a nation is doing, ask, how are the children? How are the children? How are those children, disabled children, all our children? We must have relief from student debt and medical debt and housing debt and utilities debt. How can people be so greedy with the resources that come from God in the first place? We must enact comprehensive and just immigration reform, demilitarize our southern border and immigration enforcement. We cannot continue this way and treating other Americans, because yes, those in Mexico are Americans, they're just South Americans. We cannot continue to treat the brown and black people of this world and the immigrants who desire to come here in such horrible ways. We cannot have people on horses beating down Haitians, when in fact it was the policies of the West that made Haiti such a poor country. Because after Haiti freed itself from French colonization, the countries of the West made Haiti have to pay France for the time they occupied Haiti. We created the poverty and the hurt. We cannot run away from it now. We must embrace a bold agenda to transform the economy away from all this climate chaos. You get fooled. You might have a billionaire go up there for a minute, for 15 minutes, and come back down. But this is the plan. This is where we live. This is where we are. And we have to cut these military budgets. We have to demilitarize our U.S. foreign policy. We're seeing that it doesn't work. All it does is it costs more lives and we spend more money, and we don't do the kind of things we need to do to war against the poverty and the hurt right here. We've got to end unjust mass incarceration and violent policing. It's time, and it's going to take more than an email, more than a text, more than a sermon, more than a lecture like I'm giving today, unless those lectures and sermons are calling people to the meeting. We've got to have it. And we must believe that the remnant that cries out in the street, those cries can ultimately change the conscience of the nation and change the nation itself. Amos 5 says it clearly. If I can get a remnant to fill the street and shut down the malls, then I will come and help. Think about that. God says, I'm not going to move in all of my power until you act like something's wrong. And I need those whom the wrong has been done to and those who are their allies to act as though never to become satisfied with meager responses. Never become satisfied while other members of the human race are being destroyed. God said to Amos, I need that remnant to move. Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. That Holy Spirit that calls the poor, said you have a right in Jesus' name, in God's name, declare that God's word be just. And so I've come today, not just to lecture, but to ask New York Theological Seminary and all that you're connected to be in one of those seminaries that says we'll help bring this meeting to pass. Not just a day. We don't need any more anniversary days. We don't need to be in Washington just to remember what happened in the past. No, we need a real mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington as a declaration where impacted people are the main ones on the stage, not people speaking on behalf of them, putting a face on this planet and saying that we will utilize not only our voices, but our votes. You know, poor and low-wealth people make up now 30% of the electorate. Many don't vote, and the reason they say, according to a study we did with Columbia University, is because nobody hears their name. We never have presidential debates about poverty. But if we have the right kind of meeting and the right kind of message and the right kind of momentum and movement, we can change that so that anybody that becomes president of this country has to address the issue of poverty and low wealth. They have to address poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the underfunding of our children in public education, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of nationalism. Or they cannot move 30% of the electorate. And they will start to understand that not to address these issues is constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, politically incompetent, and economically insane. Because the truth is, a moral budget is an economically sound budget. The Economic Policy Institute has written that economists have come alongside of us and said, yes, we do not have a scarcity problem. We do not have a scarcity of ideas problem. We have a scarcity of moral consciousness, and we must have a meeting. God said to Amos, get them to fill up the streets and shut down the malls, and then I will come and help. And it's true. It's true. We don't have to wonder, is this true? Because when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and some Quakers and white evangelicals came together, they turned the fusion movement into power. They cried and wailed, and they created an abolition movement. When women were rejected and didn't have the right to vote, and they came together, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all of them came together, Harriet Tubman. They were all rejected, but when they got together, it changed the policies and the consciousness of the nation. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had won the victory. Looked like segregation and separate but equal was going to be the law of the land. But when Thurgood Marshall built on the rejection, built on the minority vote of a judge from Harlan County, he dissented in 1896, and they built on that. And Thurgood Marshall building on Charles Hamilton Houston, but he got white lawyers and Jewish lawyers and female lawyers, and they all came together and they wanted the Supreme Court, but only when they cried in the public square and came together. It looked like Jim Crow had beaten down justice and couldn't rise again. But when Rosa Parks, who was rejected, and Martin Luther King, who came from rejected people, and Rabbi Heschel, rejected as a Jewish brother, and Bayard Rustin, rejected because he was gay, and James Reed, rejected, and Viola Wooster, rejected because she was a white woman willing to stand with black people, and so many more. when they cried and wailed and shut down things, God answered that remnant. They tore Jim Crow down. Apartheid in South Africa seemed invincible. But when Nelson Mandela, who was from the rejected, got together with rejected mothers of South Africa and other men in South Africa, and then Peter Story, a white minister, and then Bishop Tutu of the Anglican Church, and people all over the country. It wasn't everybody and all over the world. It wasn't everybody, but it was a remnant. And when they wailed and when they cried, it brought apartheid down. In the Bible, when the dry bones got together, the rejected in Ezekiel, they became the hope of the nation. The Bible says in Psalm, when the stones that the builders reject come together, it's the Lord's doing. And I'm telling you, in the name of the God of love, the rejected have to lead a moral revival, and we have to be a part of it. It's time now to have a meeting. Mass Poor People's Assembly, Low-Wage Workers Assembly, Moral March on Washington, not as a day, but a declaration declaring we will do more of our wailing, more of our crying, more putting an agenda before the nation, more voting, more demanding, non-violently. We will do it because it's not an option for us to accept. The rejected, the remnant will lead and must lead a moral revival. We don't need guns. We don't need evil. We don't need hate. God said to Amos, if I can just get you to use that weapon of prophetic tears, prophetic crying, prophetic demanding, prophetic wailing, that can produce a revival. Some of your adversaries will become your friends, and justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So it's time when all of us get together who love justice, who love uniting people. What a day of rejoicing it will be. So I'm asking you to help us have the meeting. Help us have a Mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington. We already have heard from other leaders around the world. I was in Rome, and many of them said, no, we don't just need to do this in Washington. We need to have it in other capitals around the world. What a day it would be. The poor and low-wealth people, and moral and religious leaders, and economists, and our advocates, and even wealthy people of conscience come together. Shut things down in a way, but also lift up a new way. And we commit on that day that it is not just a day, it is a declaration that we won't be silent or subservient or satisfied anymore. We can, in fact, according to the word of God, make it so that more justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I can't wait to see you at the meeting. God bless you.
Well, hello there. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited today to be in conversation with Bishop, the Reverend Dr. William Barber II. So grateful for a phenomenal lecture for a moral fusion, the coalition to address racism, poverty, and modern day injustice. And we're so grateful that he was our Weber lecturer this year. Dr. Barber, how are you doing, sir?
Well, I'm doing well. I actually greatly appreciate that opportunity to lecture. I actually love having a chance to teach and to think deeply about these issues. And let me thank you for all that you all are doing there at the Theological Seminary, your leadership, finding out you've spent some time in North Carolina. And so I'm just moved. The only thing I'm just so upset about is I didn't get to come in person, but we'll work that out when COVID allows.
Absolutely. We definitely want to get you back in person so that our students and our community can lay eyes on you. Would love to do for you to even share with the books that you've written, maybe a book signing or something. We're going to get that worked out. We'll definitely get that worked out. But I really just kind of want to dive in, ask you a few questions to see if you can expound a little bit more on what you talked about in the Weber lecture. And really the first thing that caught me was your notion of this crisis of possibility. I thought that was, it's so intriguing. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about that, about this crisis of possibility and what we can do, you know, as individuals to address this crisis. So often we're thinking about the big picture and what the government needs to do, what our elected officials need to do, but what can we do as individuals to affect this crisis of possibility?
Well, let me talk about it a little bit from history, in the sense that one of the things, I think it was Brueggemann, said that prophetic imagination must precede prophetic implementation, which is a very biblical model. You write the vision, make it plain. You have to have the courage to have a vision before you can have the courage to implement a vision. Dr. King often said, what we must have are people who are not merely thermometers that measure the temperature of society, but thermostats that change. Now imagine if Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and William Lord Garrison, the white evangelical, and Harriet Beecher Stowe did not have a courageous sense of possibility. In the sense, in the face of all of the ways in which the system of slavery that was undergirded by what I call evil economics, where the end justifies the means, sick sociology that suggests people can't be beside each other because of their race, there has to be a hierarchy, bad biology that says, you know, skin color by itself is a determining factor of different humanity. And then this heretical ontology that suggests that God intended it. You know, and some days they had some rough times. You know, I was reading sometimes I do a little Howard Thurman modeling. I kind of close my eyes and muse and listen to the ancestors in a kind of mystic way. And I went back and just closed my eyes and was listening at this speech that Frederick Douglass did in 1857, before the Civil War, was right after Dred Scott decision, when the Supreme Court ruled that a black man had no rights that white man ever had to pay attention to. And the story is that Frederick Douglass was asked to speak 2 months later, and he was hurt, and the movement was hurt, and people were saying it's over. They were in a crisis of possibility. The abolition movement is over because the courts are against us, the magistrates are against us, the army is against us, the nation, so forth. And Frederick Douglass in that speech lays out all of the things that are against us. But rather than leaning into the crisis, rather than giving into the crisis of possibility, toward the end he has the courage of possibility. And he says, if I can remember quote him, he says, the things we are facing are monstrous and they intend to win. But maybe what we see happening is the necessary chain of events towards the downfall and overturning of the entire system. There is a Supreme Court of men, but there is a Supreme Court of God. And then he says, what I know is that every attempt to ally and stop the abolition movement has only served to embolden and intensify our agitation. So rather than giving into the crisis of possibility, he had the courage to believe in possibility. In our nation right now, when you hear people saying that we have a lack of resources, that's a crisis of possibility, and it's a lie, because we do not have a scarcity of resources in this country to address poverty and low wealth. When you hear people say that the policies, we can't do this, we do not have a scarcity of ideas. What we have is a scarcity of moral consciousness. And so what happens is things have been turned upside down. So for instance, today, and I'll end here, people claim to be moderates, but moderate seems to mean how many people you can keep from getting helped. That's what a moderate seems to be.
Wow.
We approach something like 140 million people in poverty, nearly 50% of the population, and people just accept that as though it's supposed to be. It's okay. Over 50% of our children, when in fact, none of this has to exist. It all exists because of policy. And so what we must do as people, poor, low-wealth people, religious leaders who walk by faith and other people, is not give in to the crisis of possibility. But we have to help this country believe again. And every major transformation in this country came when a remnant of people said, you know what? It doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be like this. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign is saying. When they tell us that we can't do a budget, we write one. When they say poor people don't really vote, we do the research and find out why. And we also, when they say we don't have the money, we meet with economists and we say, yes, you do. Because what we will not do is give in. And say nothing can be done. And that's the crisis of poverty. Too many people have stopped believing and just have started accepting what is in fact unacceptable.
And you know what? It's so true. And I really appreciate what you're saying, because not only do we relegate it to policy, but often, Rev, we relegate these problems to God. We make them God problems when in fact they are human problems. When you think about hunger, as you said, there's no lack of resources. There's no shortage of resources. There's enough food on this planet for everybody to eat. You know, when you think about homelessness, there's no lack of resources. There is enough, wood and timber. There is enough resources. God has given us the resources that we need to do the work that needs to be done. There's no need, for policy, for poverty. It's about greed and finding ways to recognize the humanity of everyone and honor that humanity. So not only do we think about this crisis of possibility in terms of policy, but also in terms of how we relegate this and make it God problems as well, especially when you think about us being in the theological context. How do we get to the root of that and stop blaming God for things that we can take responsibility and accountability for?
Well, sometimes it is required for us to be prophetic to the church first. Judgment has to begin in the house of God and among the people of God. And one of the things that is challenging for me as a clergy person, I grew up in the church, I've been in the church all my life, is to think about the fact that there are more than 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that talk about how God calls us to live in relationship to the poor and the kind of justice we should demand of society. That God is not a God of, God is a God of justice, not just a God of benevolence. He does not call us to just fight to be benevolent, but to be just and to create just society. And yet, if you cut all those scriptures out of the Bible would fall apart. I mean, there's a Bible called the Poverty and Justice Bible. You've probably seen it. And every passage in the scriptures that has to do with how we stand in relationship to the poor, the least of these, women, children, and the immigrant, are all marked. And one day, some students who were tired of folk who claimed to believe in the inerrancy of scripture, telling them that the Bible said the only thing they should really be concerned about is being against gay people and being against a woman's right to choose and being for tax cuts and being a Republican and acting like Jesus was a founding member of the NRA. They said, we're going to actually read the Bible. And when they did, mark these scriptures, and they cut them out and the Bible fell apart. In other words, if you don't deal with the issues like poverty and injustice and healthcare and mistreatment of least of these, the Bible does not exist. Now, why do I say that? To get at your question. Well, then why is it that in our churches, for instance, you can go some places all year long and never hear a sermon on poverty and dealing with the systems of poverty. You can never hear Jesus' first sermon, which was his inaugural sermon that he started with and he ended with. Good news to the poor is where Jesus started. Luke 4:18, church folk tried to kill him that day. How you treat the least of these and to nations, not to individuals, to the nations and the government was his last sermon. So he ended where he started, right? We have, in a way, sometimes been negligent in the church. On some places we've been negligent because we turned the church into only a praise party and a name it, claim it, and call it and haul it. Then in the other place, we have gotten quarantined and we've locked church inside of the building rather than church being a movement that, yes, comes inside of the building, but is also like Jesus in the street and challenging Caesar and challenging the policies. And so, you know, we've got to be critical of the church. Public theology and prophetic preaching are not supposed to be marginal in the church. It's at the center of who we are. I'm often troubled by when people say to me, Reverend Barber, I appreciate your prophetic ministry, but now my ministry is praying, or and I'm saying, well, mine is too. God is that. You know, God is not schizophrenic. One of my professors, Dr. William Turner, said there are three poles. You have to have holiness, which is not a sense of arrogance, but a sense of being called by God. Have to have, he said, deep, worshipful spirituality. But you also have to have prophetic social consciousness, and they all are tied together. This is not new, because in Ezekiel chapter 22, it's interesting that God tells Ezekiel to speak to the nations, and he says, and this is what he tells him, he says, look, your politicians have become like wolves, devouring the people, and they've become like wolves because your priests are saying things to them that I have not said. And then he says, who will stand in the gap? I'm looking for somebody to stand in the gap. And then God says, but I could find nobody. And then 15 chapters later, he finds the people to stand in the gap, but he finds them in the valley of dry bones. Among the dead. They become the ones that have to lead the revival and have to lead the religious cultus out of its indifference. So we've got to be very careful in this moment that we don't just say, well, God will fix it. Or we say crazy things like, well, didn't God say that the poor will always be with you?
Yeah.
But that's not the whole scripture. You go read the whole scripture, the poor will be with you because you do this and you do this. It was created by humankind's injustice toward each other. It is not the design of God. The church has to make sure that we do not continue in any way to promote that. In fact, we have to call it what it is: sin. You know, structural racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health and care, the war economy, sin. And lastly, Madam President, I think we need to do something. I didn't talk about it much in the lecture, but we've got to decide in this country whether death is going to keep being an option. Because the reality is, poverty is not just, oh, those poor folk. 700 people die a day from poverty, 250,000 a year. Before COVID, 7 people died from vaping, and there was a congressional hearing and a White House coming together. 700 people died a day from poverty. And even to this day, even in the last presidential election, there was not one 30-minute debate on the issue of what are we going to do to address a reality that 43% of this nation living unnecessarily.
Yeah.
43% of this nation live in poverty and or low wealth, and not 130 minutes. So the church has to recover that calling to cry loud and spare not, and make sure we're not having the wrong fast, as Isaiah would say, Isaiah 58. We got to have the right fast, which is demanding that the bands of wickedness be loosed, and so forth and so on.
Wow. Yeah, you have said so many pieces in that response. One of the things I definitely want to pick up on, and you spoke about this during the Weber lecture, is the importance of truth telling. That we must tell the truth about, these crises that we are experiencing. And I guess I just want to have, a conversation about why that's so difficult. And is it because, the truth is in the eye of the beholder? Is there a difference between truth and the truth? Why are we all looking at the same situation, but we're seeing it differently? How do we get to the point where there is this collective truth, where we can acknowledge these issues, whether it's healthcare, the poverty, and be able to move forward, understanding that the crisis is affecting all of us, and not just those who we think those the least of these, as they might be referred to. But this notion of truth telling, it keeps coming up. So can you talk a little bit about this notion of truth and why we see things so differently?
What was it that Orwell said? Telling the truth in a time of deceit is revolutionary in and of itself.
Yeah.
But in America, hadn't that been our problem? Lies. I mean, racism is rooted in lies. Denial of women's rights was rooted in lies. Yeah. Blocking labor rights, lies. When we talk about raising the living wage, the lies that they come up with, the lie that it's going to hurt businesses and cause people to lose jobs. Just recently, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to several economists who have debunked that entire lie, that actually said, you know what, paying people a living wage, a decent wage, would pump $300 and some odd billion into the economy every year, and it would not make prices go up, nor would it cost jobs. But greed and the love of money is rooted in deception. And one of the things we have is so much money now. In Virginia, just the other day, they spent $120 million in that election. In last year's presidential election, $14 billion. So a lot of money is put behind the lies. And America, in many ways, has grown up with so much distortion. That's why people are making all this fuss out of something that I don't even say it anymore, critical. I don't even say it because it's just wrong the way it's being framed. Anybody that's not critical is not thinking. But the great fear is that people will hear the truth. Now, if you are in a season of lies, the one place that has to tell that truth is the pulpit and the church. And then secondly, we have to be among the people, I believe, and take that truth into the public square. And there are two truths we have to tell. One is the truth about what is. The other is the truth about what could be.
Yes.
In the Poor People's Campaign, that's why we say, we've been 3 years, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral power. Our first two goals was to shift the narrative, tell the truth, and to build power. That's why the first, and one of the things we have to do in telling truth, we must make sure we have the truth, because there are a lot of narratives that we have bought into that sound true, and so places repeat them that we think are credible. Let me give you one. Take, for instance, poverty. For the longest time, I was believing that 39 million people were poor in America, because that's what they were telling us in the government. And the government way of measuring poverty, which is 50-some days outdated, and it was a bad measurement when it was first created, basically says if you make $12,800 or $900 a year, you're not poor. Well, one of the things conscientious economists said to us is the first thing you need to do before you do any campaign and be bringing people together is you got to agree on the facts.
Yeah.
And I want to say this particularly to seminary, because I know a lot of times, why have I got to do all this study? I just want to do praxis. Well, you need praxis and theory and praxis. They are not dichotomous.
Yeah.
So we had to sit down with a group of economists, public health officials, and say, give us the real facts and numbers disaggregated by race and gender and sexuality and region in these 5 areas. And when they came back and said, look, we got something to tell you all. And we said, what? We said, now it's a truth, and it's not going to be easy at first. People are going to tell you you're lying, and you're going to have to, your main purpose of your movement is you're going to have to keep building and keep saying it, and you're going to have to put a face on it. And we said, what is that? They said 140 million, not 39 million. And we said, no way. And they said, yeah. We said, no way in the world this country got 140 million poor, lower people. And they're lying about the fact that it's only 39 million. They said, yeah. They have marginalized poverty. And then they said, wait a minute, let's do something else, because you may have to challenge even some of your African-American leaders on this. They said, and the majority of those folk are not Black. They said there are 40 million more poor and low wealth people in this country than the white people than there are Black. So then somebody on the team said, wait a minute, you're trying to say that the Black are disproportionate. They said, no, it's a truth. Yeah. In raw numbers, it's more white. In percentage, it's more Black.
It's more Black, yeah.
So the number of poor and low wealth white people in percentage of race is around 30%. The number of poor and low wealth Black people is 60.9%. Now think about that, Madam President. When I go to my church every Sunday morning, I don't care how folk look, I don't care what their hairdo says, I don't care what the suit says, 6 out of 10 folk looking at me cannot afford a $500 emergency. That's the truth. 31% of this nation cannot afford $1,000. Only 31% of this nation can afford a $1,000 emergency. That means 69% of the nation. Yeah. When I look out at a congregation or walk down the street, and you gotta, it's almost like cutting a tree down. You gotta tell it and keep telling it, because you're gonna get pushed back. The first time we told it, the Washington Post of all places took us on. This is wrong, and we said check it.
Yeah. And
then they had to come back and apologize, basically. Mm-hmm. So truth. I like the way you said it. There's the small T truth, and then there's the big T truth.
Yeah.
And every transformative movement, first goal has to be to shift the narrative. I answer sometimes with stories. So, for instance, Martin Luther King's speech at the March on Washington was not "I Have a Dream." People say, yes, it was. It was. But I do that to make folks think, because if you think that the speech was "I have a dream," then you missed that the first 17 minutes was truth-telling. It wasn't about the dream, it was about the nightmare.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about Black folk. The March on Washington was a march for jobs and justice. And they had an agenda that wasn't just the Civil Rights Act. It was $2 minimum wage, which would be $15 today. And the speech was actually "Normalcy Never Again." That was the title of the speech.
Yeah.
And his own advisors had told him not to do "I Have a Dream." Mahalia Jackson, standing there at the podium after he finished, said, "Tell him about the dream," because she knew that he had dealt so much truth that the people needed to have that prophetic hope. Why is it then that the popular remembrance of Dr. King is limited to what we basically call in the Black church his hoop, his closing hoop?
Yeah.
Because somebody does not want to hear the truth. So small T, he did say "I have a dream." Big T, though, that wasn't. And you don't get to the big T, it actually disables our ability, because we're remembering wrong. and we're not adequately dealing with the real problem. I think that's why today you can have right now this morning people talking about passing an infrastructure bill, which one study is saying that 80% of the money will probably go to white men, and it will raise the deficit. And you have people saying, oh, that's the most important thing. Now, the Build Back Better plan at $1.7 trillion is actually about $8 trillion less than what it ought to be to actually deal with the problem prior COVID and after.
Yeah.
But people are saying that bill is too much. Why is it too much? Because they don't start with the truth, and that is the truth of how many people will be hurt if we don't do this.
Yeah,
not how much does it cost if we do it, how much does it cost if we don't.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. That's good, Rev. And I know our time is drawing now. Just have a couple of more questions. I definitely want to get in there. One of the things that I think is certainly worth mentioning is I'm wondering what your perspective is on how deep the connection of poverty is to mass incarceration, right? Because we know that poverty not only affects adults, it affects children who are growing up in circumstances that they should not have to grow up in, certainly not in this country that we live. New York Theological Seminary is actually the only school in the state of New York that offers a master's degree at a correctional facility. We offer our master's in professional studies, at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. It started in 1982 by former President Dr. Weber. And since that time, we've graduated nearly 530 men from Sing Sing. And we're actually looking to have this program at Bedford Hills so we can have it at a women's facility as well and offer women the same kind of opportunity. But just thinking about poverty and the impact of poverty, when you look at incarceration, and certainly the incarceration of Black and Brown people more than anyone else. But talk about the connection and how, in truth telling, we could possibly come up with other alternatives to this problem that our nation continues to face.
Yeah, the fact that we put 1 million more people in prison than China, and China has 1 billion more people than us.
Yeah.
Michelle Alexander's right when she says this is the new Jim Crow, and you have the prison industrial complex. You have the criminalization of poverty. Most people in jail plea bargain because they don't have the money to afford the legal representation. In my short lifetime, I've been a part of 6 Black men being exonerated from death row who would have been killed if our death penalty system worked faster. And majority of them were exonerated because they were represented by counsel that was overworked and overwhelmed because they were public defenders and they didn't have money to go out. When you look at the criminal justice system and how even money that goes into communities, you say, well, why is it that certain communities want prisons? It's because the tax dollars follow the prisoners. And so whenever people are taken out of a community and placed in the prison, then also not the taxes that they would pay, but the money, the services that come because of their presence in the community and the government spending follows them to prison. So it goes where they're accounted for those services. People in prison are counted for the money, the kinds of money that come in that community. Children are left without parents. The overwhelming majority are Black and Brown people. And then there's a direct connection between who's in poverty and who's illiterate, who's uneducated. When people come out of incarceration, so oftentimes they are disenfranchised. There was a study that was done that said the number of people that have been disenfranchised from their voting, particularly Black people, could actually turn elections. North Carolina, the state we just won a case after all these years where the court said that all 56,000 people who had gone in prison in North Carolina who are now out and pay their debt to society must get their voting rights automatically returned. But for so long, that was not the case. So you can't, and that's what we say, you can't separate.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, for instance, systemic racism in our movement, we mean the racism that comes at Black people, but we look at all of it, the voting rights, incarceration, the disparity in healthcare, whatnot. But we also look at racism and how it impacts brown people, Asian people, and Native Americans, and the collateral damage done to poor white people. Dr. King often said that it is the suppression of the wages of Black people also hurts poor white people. Yeah. So we organize people from Appalachia, white Appalachia, to Black Alabama. And one of the things we find out is that there is a kind of incarceration of society. There is a willingness to criminalize poverty. And there was a book that I read. I don't know if the person that was at New York at the seminary there, but it was called The Crucified God. The Crucified, no, not the Crucified God. It was called The Incarcerated God. I know that was a chapter. Anyway, the question was posed to somebody: why is it that we in New York, we want to place more money in incarcerating people than in educating them? Yeah. And the person answered anonymously in the book. This was somebody that really worked in the system. And this was their answer. Well, some of us want to live a certain way. And we can't live that way if certain people are around us. So we create ghettos. But the ghettos fill up, and we have to have somewhere to send people. Wow. I mean, this was somebody reflecting on why the criminal justice system is so heavily funded in a state like New York. I wrote about it in my work for my doctoral degree. I may send it to you. But yeah, and the criminalization of poverty has us locked up. That's what's wrong with our possibility. This we don't have an ability to think beyond just criminalization. And then what makes you really mad, and the boys in the hood talk to me about this all the time. They said, Reverend Barber, this system is just whacked out. And I said, what do you mean? They said, now, all along we were told that selling weed was criminal. We got all these people in jail for selling weed. And now, as soon as the government decided it can make some money off of it, now the thing we were thrown in jail for, people are making $1 million weed stores. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, we were actually having a conversation about that, myself and some of my girlfriends, because we're talking about the fact that the cannabis industry, you know, is already $1 billion industry. We took it back to, you know, with prohibition, you know, how it was, you know, we had some great aunts and uncles and grandpas that, you know, were bootleggers. And then as soon as, right, for survival, but then as soon as they ended prohibition, we missed out on that train in terms of the economics that came behind that. The same thing happened with the numbers runners, right? We have uncles and fathers and grandfathers were running numbers, and they came up with the lottery. And we lost out in that train. And the same thing is happening here with cannabis, and the church and Black folks. It's been so stigmatized that we once again are being the last to even consider being a part of this industry that's coming along. So you're absolutely right.
And let me say this. And one of the things that I want to, let me just say what I'm going to say, and that the chips fall where they may. You know, one of the problems too is, you know, you heard me say 60.9% of our people are in poverty, but most of our civil rights organization, poverty is not a #1 issue. No, and the fact that poverty and racism is not either or, it's both and.
Yeah.
You know, I had a conversation with some people in the Black caucus in the Congress. I said, why is poverty If 60.9% of Black people are poor and low wealth, why is poverty not a major number one top issue? Why is it not? And they were like, and one person said, we our focus is voting right. We just get voting right. We can fix all this. I said, no, it's not either or. And then another said, but I grew up poor. I said, I'm not talking about how you grew up. I'm talking about the fact that we have 52% of our children living in poverty and low wealth before COVID. And what COVID did is it exposed the fissures of racism and poverty. How is it that this happened? And it's the same way with criminalization. Now, right now, people are talking about, when a white cop shoots an unarmed Black man or woman, and yes, we should march. Yes, we should do it. Yes, we should have the George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor. It should be named after all of them. But we also have to be careful that we don't think we don't limit our examination and criticism and critique of the criminal justice system to just that issue, because there are brothers dying in prison who shouldn't be there. There are brothers and sisters dying after prison. The system is killing people, not just with the gun, right? As I shared with you, there's a young man right now in North Carolina. His name is, it'll come to me in a minute. And he was put in jail at 19 years old for a crime he did not commit. They forced a white young lady who later recanted and told the police did to testify. They knew he was innocent and the killer is still around. He was offered plea bargains, but he would not accept them because he knew he was innocent. He spent 24 years in prison for a crime he did not do. We finally got it back in front of the judge. The judge exonerated him. Now watch this. The judge exonerated him. But the governor, a Democratic governor, will still not pardon him for more than 2 years. The pardon doesn't come automatically. So this man is put out he leaves prison and is just basically told, take your coat and what you had and go. So you thrust him out into society in poverty. If he didn't have some friends around to pick him up and help him, and the governor is more afraid of that he might look easy on crime. When this guy was exonerated, and to be quite honest, a bulk of the time he was in prison, a lot of our organizations didn't take it up because he was poor. They said he must have done something. Right. Out there he was a drug dealer and he wasn't. They lied. And basically they buried that man alive. They buried him alive. So we cannot just limit our critique. I'm glad you asked that question about the criminal justice system to just when a cop kills someone, as horrific and ugly as that is. This infatuation with criminalization of poverty in our people must be addressed in all of its brutality.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Barber. I have just one more question for you, and it's really specifically intended for our seminarians and those that are wrestling with call. Before we started the recording, we were talking a little bit, and you shared how your father left the church to pursue a call that he felt that was in another direction. And so often we think that call is limited to the church, but call can be so much bigger than that. Even when I think about what you're doing with the Poor People's Campaign. And so folks are struggling with call in terms of, do I have to be a preacher? Can I find another way to fulfill my call serving the people? There are some nonprofits out there. Can I start something? So can you talk a little bit about call and discernment, specifically as it's related to, the church and preaching and other needs that are in our world, that those who feel they have a sense of call can look to find ways to intersect with those things?
Well, one of the things I think people ought to do, particularly in seminary, is read the prophets and the various lifestyles that they had And it was in those places they were called. You know, like Amos said, I'm just a farmer. Isaiah had been raised with priests, or Peter was fisherman, and Paul was a tent maker and a rabbinical leader. So first of all, I think that we can be called from various places, and we can be called while we're doing work, and that work that we're doing may inform even our calling. No wonder the disciples talked a lot about fishing. No wonder, Amos could describe, the society in terms of agriculture. I mean, you don't have to necessarily abruptly leave one to do the other. You know, my father, I mentioned to you, was he had to wrestle with this question. He was educated and trained and prepared up north in Indiana. He went to St. Aug first in North Carolina, then went to Georgia, then left Georgia, went to Indiana, was trained. And here it was 1963 when I was born, 2 days after the March on Washington. He listened to what Dr. King and others were saying. And then he received a call from a principal, black principal of a black school that had yet to be desegregated. This is 10 years after Brown. And they said, Barber, you can help us, because Indiana had done some desegregation. And would you come home and help us? And he didn't leave the church. He left the church he was at, where he was. And he packed up and he said, I have to go where I'm needed. Now, he left an upward projection. They were preparing him to move right on up through the ranks of the church and the administration. They had high hopes, but God had a higher call. And at some point, you got to make the decision of whether you're going to be successful or significant. Sometimes the two go together, but sometimes they don't. I'm a pastor. And one reason I love talking to seminary, because I won't let anybody come along and say, well, I would be involved, but I'm a pastor. I'm saying that if you are a pastor and you're not concerned about the stresses and the trauma and the injustices that your people face, that's a form of pastoral misconduct. There was a little book written some time ago called Pastoral Care and Prophetic Leadership. And part of it was that if you read, for instance, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4, verse 18, where Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, a healing of the broken heart. The Greek word for healing there, it has dualistic meaning. It can mean laying on of hands and praying for people and anointing them with oil. But it also can mean finding out what's making them sick and remove that. So I come from a tradition, for instance, my father and others were involved in as pastors. One of it is when down in Warren County years ago in the 70s, people were getting sick, just dying of cancer. And churches were praying and having special services and tent revivals and whatnot. But Leon White, who was a pastor, my father and others decided, what's causing all of this? So they started going out at night, and they found that this company was bringing PCB trucks into the community at night and pouring that mess into the ditches, and it was seeping into the water table. So as pastors, their job then was not just to pray for people to be healed miraculously, but to stand in the miraculous power of God and stop this company from destroying the community. Yeah. So I want to say that to the seminary students that as a pastor, you are the resident theologian, not only in that church family, but in that community. And we have a calling. I know it's not easy. I've pastored the church. We've had multiple millions of dollars of buildings and all of that. But you still have a responsibility to have that prophetic, pastoral, and priestly voice. And then lastly, I would agree with you. Sometimes what you're called to pastor is not just a formal church. In some ways, people call me the pastor, the bishop of the Poor People's Campaign, or the pastor or bishop, of the movement. And I kind of see it like this. I don't see what I'm doing and what Reverend Dr. Leah Steele Harris is doing as separate from the gospel. It is a part of the gospel. It is fundamentally a part of the gospel. So what I say to folk is, this is what you need to find in seminaries. Answer this question. What is it that you're being called to that produces a quarrel with the world's existing injustices? Because if whatever you have, whatever spirituality you claim, however you claim to have gotten it, laid out on the floor, in the Eastern Orthodox setting, looking at an icon with smoke all around, in high church, in Pentecostal church, in Baptist church, the laying on of hands and speaking in tongues, whatever you claim you say this is a sign and symbol of my spirituality. If that does not produce a quarrel with the world's injustices, a challenge to the world's injustices, if it does not deal with poverty and the brokenhearted and the hurting and the captive, and does not seek to find a place of welcome for all of those who have been made to feel unwelcome, if it does not challenge the nations to have justice, not just benevolence on Thanksgiving and Christmas, then perhaps your claim to spirituality, especially Christian spirituality, is terribly suspect. Because I don't know anywhere in Scripture where people were called by the Spirit of God, whatever they were doing, that it did not produce a quarrel with the pharaohs and the Caesars of their time.
Yeah.
So wherever you are, in a nonprofit, a chaplain, part of that role is, how is what you're doing a part of the nonviolent, love-centered, truth-bearing, justice-seeking move in the earth to make what is wrong right? Now, some people say, well, all that'll be done when heaven comes, but you better be working on it till heaven comes.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, thank you so much, Bishop, for joining us today, for taking the time to be in conversation. We are so appreciative of you and the work that you're doing for our nation, and yet even for the world. And we pray God's blessings and strength upon you as you continue to move forward. Thank you again for being with us.
As we leave, can I make one thing? Please, everybody, organize a bus, every pastor, 2 if you can, 1,700 if you come from a church like the president comes from, and be there on June 18, 2022 for this mass Poor People's Low Wage Workers Assembly Moral March on Washington, not as a day, but as a declaration that we're going to speak the truth, we're going to shift the narrative, we're going to build power. We cannot accept what is. And then lastly, remember something as you move, particularly as clergy. It's not about being in the majority. In the lecture, I talked about Amos saying remnant. I hadn't seen that for years. I read "Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like a mighty stream," but I hadn't really gone back before those verses where God said to Amos, "I need this remnant that will cry in the streets, that will shut down everything." And say, this is not right. And then God says, I'll assist you. I want all the seminarians to remember, and any other preachers, another text. Isaiah was called to be a prophet. And he asked the Lord this question that you gotta be careful of asking the Spirit. He said, how long? And the Lord said, until. And Isaiah got real and said, well, how many people gonna hear me? And you read it there, if you read it in the Message Bible particularly, but the answer came back 10%. That's all it's gonna hear you. You think about Isaiah now, the one who wrote, woe unto those who legislate evil, the one who wrote, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. A lot of those scriptures we think is popular, but when Isaiah was told to preach that, He was told by God, you will only reach 10%. But then the same angels and spirits said, and God said, but that 10% will be the remnant that will transform the nation.
That's good.
That 10% will be so don't get overwhelmed about how many, people. Get clearly convinced of the message of love and justice and truth that comes through Jesus Christ. And know that even if your assignment is to the remnant, we come from the faith where strange things happen in graveyards. We come through a faith where the stones that the builders reject end up becoming the chief cornerstone of new possibility. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you so much. God bless you, sir.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
At one time, poverty was a temporary condition. You were on a down slope for a minute, but you could bounce back up. We can't bounce back up today. It's permanent. We're not going back to the factory and building cars and trucks like we once did.
A job working at McDonald's or the grocery store doesn't pay enough for one person to live.
We work a 40-hour work week. Still not enough. Living from paycheck to paycheck. Rent is $600 a month. We got water bill, electricity. I do this for my kids, and it hurts.
We were in the height of mass water shutoffs. This entire neighborhood was shut off all at one time.
I saw all my neighbors get shut off right in front of me. It was kind of terrifying. I'm 42 years old, and I'm a cashier at McDonald's. I had lost my house. You're welcome to come inside. There's a lot of people that are living in their cars. You never notice until you're in the same situation.
I don't have stuff to give my children. I'm paying all these bills, and they need school clothes and stuff. They be asking me for, I can't give it to them.
I see poverty in my own community. There's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
Here in New York City, we're home to millionaires and billionaires, and we have so many people living in the street, and that's just not right.
I've been a homeless veteran twice, lived in a shelter.
I've been living down here since I was 17.
I'm from Flint, Michigan. You can't imagine being in my footsteps. I have children who have never had the experience of drinking from the tap.
700,000 people in this country are on the verge of losing their food stamps.
This budget calls for shrinking the social safety net programs like Medicare.
I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right.
I'm in stage 5 of kidney disease. I fell behind on my health care, and they canceled my health insurance, and they told me I have to wait until open enrollment. There's only 5 stages of kidney disease, and I'm in the 5th stage. Murder, it's murder. If you ask me, it's murder.
I lost a son to gun violence, and I lost a daughter.
No parent in America should have to bury their child for a lack of medical expense. I'm wailing because my children,
My God.
are no more.
My God. My God, Kelly.
I'm wailing, y'all. I'm wailing. Because my babies ain't no more. How many more babies? How many more children?
No more.
What an evening it has been. We've heard from Dr. LaKeesha Walrond, our president.
We've heard from our lecturer of the evening, Dr. William J. Barber. But now we must hear from you. Yes, you. This is an appeal for you to support the continuous work that we do here at New York Theological Seminary, with the focus on preparing faith and thought leaders to engage in relevant, restorative, and transformative ministry. NYTS seeks to provide a relevant and rigorous theological education that is accessible, inclusive, and transformative. We want to prepare students to be creative, innovative, and relevant in their ministry context, and finally promote deeper engagement and authentic relationship with the Creator and all creation. Join us in supporting the work of our amazing president, Reverend Dr. LaKeesha Walrond, our dean, the board, the faculty, the staff, as we invest in our students and in our communities to work to fund more scholarship dollars and enhance our brand awareness on a global scale. A charitable gift to New York Theological Seminary is an investment in the future. With your financial support, NYTS, we can continue our legacy of excellence and remain a world-class graduate theological school and achieve our dreams of becoming one of the leading faith and thought institutions in the world that prepares leaders to engage in urban ministry. You can give by visiting our website and clicking on the Donate Now, or by typing the link here on our stream. And not only are you giving to the institution, but portions of the proceeds collected on tonight will go toward the Poor People's Campaign and the wonderful work that Dr. Barber and all the partners across the country are doing. So give today. Thank you and God.